Okay, it's Sunday, September the 15th. Rosh Hashanah is the 29th. Be sure and fasten your seatbelt just in case. Bible prophecy lesson number 235, and we're in Isaiah. This is chapter 2 today. We'll review chapter 1. We got a bunch of signs of the times and scriptures, and then we'll do Isaiah chapter 2. Dean, open us with a word of prayer.
Heavenly Father, we're so grateful, Lord, to be here today, Lord, learn more about your word. We ask you to speak through Carl, Lord, your Holy Spirit. We might learn more about you. May we glorify you each and every day. Forgive us when we fail you, Lord. Bless this class and those who are unsaved. Use them, we pray,
Amen. Okay, we've been, our thesis here for Isaiah as we're starting out is that Isaiah was written 700 years before Christ. And in 700 BC, Israel was very much like the United States is today. Now, Jonathan Cahn's book, The Oracle, he makes note of the fact that every Jubilee year, well, at some Jubilee year, like the last Jubilee year before the end of the age, everything should return to the way it was at the beginning of the age. And that beginning of the age means when Christ was here on the earth. And what we find out is it's pretty much like that. Because in the time of Christ, certainly to be a Christian was a perilous thing. Christians got crucified. They got burned at the stake. Bad things happened to them. The world was against them. Rome was in control. Rome was a heathenistic country. And the things that were going on this planet, they were all pagan. Idol worship. Yeah, idol worship was very common. There were all kinds of idols out. The Arabs, they had hundreds of gods. And around 1500 AD, Muhammad came along and said, well, there's really only one God. And that's the moon god. And El-Alat was the name of the moon god. And that's where Allah came from, the moon god. That's why you see the crescent moon on the Islamic flag. So we would expect, if we are at the end of the age, we ought to be seeing the same thing. If Jonathan Cahn's correct, and I think he is, at least in this point, and that is the criticisms that God had of ancient Israel, 700 BC, and 2,000 years ago, apply to this country. Israel was a rich country. They had no problems. And it just seems like that Israel was on a sinusoidal curve, when they get up here to the point where they're rich, they're wealthy, everything is great, they forget God. They go after other gods and they intermarry with the tribes of the region. And like Solomon, even though he had 700 wives, he was supposed to be the smartest man in the world, right? Yep. Figure that one out. 700 wives, smartest man in the world. Well, at any rate, his wives they worshiped foreign gods. So what did he do? The very God that gave him everything that he had, he turned his back on him, started worshiping other gods. I can't understand that, but that's the way it happened. But you look at our country. How were we founded? We were founded by people of deep Christian faith. Right. The Mayflower Compact states specifically that the reason for that immigration group, and Columbus and his team, was to advance the Christian religion. in the world. And all of our laws that were made by our founding fathers were designed with an understanding that we were a Christian nation.
Right.
This business of a separation of church and state is a myth. It was understood to be one that the state supported the Christian religion. There wasn't any conflict back in those days. It was understood to be that way. They didn't feel they needed to write anything down about it. Wish they had, but at any rate, moving right along. The people of that genre, 700 AD, they had abandoned the Holy One of Israel and rebelled and behaved like Sodom and Gomorrah. Boy, if there was ever a nation that deserved that epitaph, it's ours. We are so messed up right now that it is almost a high crime and a misdemeanor. Certainly it is a crime in Canada if you call someone a him who thinks is a her.
I'm willing to go to jail on
Yeah. Well, if you're in Canada, that's what happens, and it's getting that way here. Every day, more bizarre, crazy things come out.
Well, in California, you have to say they or them. You can't say man or female or congressman or
Yeah, you can't call them homeless either.
you can't call them, yeah.
They are just, I don't know what the term is.
that.
Yeah, they're, yeah,
It's something, I forgot the word for it, they're calling them now.
yeah, Dean.
A lot of the homeless people can't afford the rent because it's so expensive, they're not a rent.
Yeah.
But of course, a lot of them are bums, but some of them don't want to be homeless. They just can't afford the rent.
Well, that's another dilemma. At any rate, moving right along, the Lord offered to change their crimson sin to white to those that would return to his will. And of course, we made note of the fact that the Jews in their Talmud report that sometime around 30 AD, the crimson rope tied to the horns of the altar and the other side that was tied to the scapegoat, when the scapegoat died, the crimson cord around the horns of the altar would turn white. Did that for many years up until around 30 AD. And after 30 AD, never turned white again. And the lot for the scapegoat always came up in the left hand, and the lot for the goat for the Lord always came up in the priest's right hand, some 20 or 30 years before 30 AD. After 30 AD, all the bets were off again. It went back to random. Something happened around 30 AD. The Jews can't figure it out. Gee, I wonder what happened. Well, the lamb that takes away the sins of the world was sacrificed, and his blood took care of sin for once and forever.
Hallelujah.
So, then in chapter 1 we learned that the Lord promises dire straits to the evildoer, and he will burn like tinder with nothing to quench the fire. Never happened though, did it? Well, guess what? It's on the way. So, right along. Some churches have lost numbers because they lost the message, says Ravi Zacharias, whatever that name is. Well, I think he's there. Some churches are losing people because they have failed to preach the real gospel and instead only offering feel-good moments. This apologist Ravi says. Speaking to Fox News, he says that while evangelicals had grown in numbers, mainstream churches were struggling because they were drifting from the main message of the Bible. Ooh. Some of the mainliners have lost numbers and they should have lost numbers because they lost the message, he said. Well, I think you can see that in a lot of places. The big mega churches, they don't dare talk about fundamental doctrines because they might offend somebody. And then people would leave, and then they couldn't afford to build and maintain their big mega churches.
Gossip and gluttony, you never hear that message preached.
Yeah. Tom Hanks accepted the role of the church minister TV star because it offered a positive alternative to cynicism. I don't know the story of Tom Hanks. I don't think he's a Christian, but I think he made a, he's what? He's a Catholic?
He can still be a Christian.
Well, maybe he's a Christian anyway.
His name is involved in all the Pentecost stuff.
Is it? Uh-oh. Well, at any rate, he saw something positive about Mr. Rogers. Interesting guy. He said, cynicism is one of the reasons why he decided to take the role of America's children's TV icon Fred Rogers in his new movie, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. The critics have praised Hank's portrayal of the mild-mannered Mr. Rogers in the movie, which had its world premiere in Toronto Film Festival on Saturday ahead of its U.S. debut on Thanksgiving. I didn't know that. I didn't know it was coming out on Thanksgiving. Sounds like something to be worthwhile to see. Mr. Rogers, who died in 2003, was a Presbyterian church minister who entertained generations of American children with his TV show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Speaking to reporters about why the role appealed to him, Hank said, cynicism has become the default position for so many in the daily structure and in daily intercourse. Well, I don't know how you can live in Hollywood and not be a cynic. Whoa, signs that Iran's regime is close. We could be witnessing the death throes of the Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic is in a perfect storm, and sanctions have hurt their economy. Tehran's hopes that European and Asian countries would ignore U.S. sanctions have fallen short. As businessmen calculate that they cannot risk U.S. penalties regardless of what their own governments wish. The Islamic Republic's old guard is dying of old age, and the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, realizes he may not be far behind. Hallelujah on that one. Unlike in 1989, the last time Iran had a leadership transition at the very top, there is no clear successor nor confidence within the system that transition will be smooth. Well, you know how the transition usually works. One guy gets killed, and then they fight over who's going to get to replace him. And whoever wins the fights and the battles, that's the guy who gets to be on top. It's very much like our system. This organization does not sell arms, but this one does. Ooh. Just saw a sign that said, I would rather have 1,000 Muslim customers in my shop than one U.S. soldier. Funeral directors are funny people. Moving right along, Isaiah chapter 2. The word that Isaiah, the son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Now it shall come to pass in the latter days, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of all the mountains, and it shall be exalted above all the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. This latter days thing is almost every time used in the scripture is a phrase that is pointing to the millennial reign. And then it says that the mountains of the Lord's house will be established. It says on the top of the mountains, it's on top of the mountain, and will be established and exalted above all the hills. The other passages in the scripture tell us that all the mountains are going to fall down flat. And there will only be one mountain, and that mountain will be in Jerusalem. And on top of that mountain, as we'll read and understand here in just a minute, there will be a city. And that city, of course, is Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem is a temple, and in the temple is the Messiah. So it will be the highest point on planet Earth. All the nations will flow to it. And many peoples will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So the Lord is going to be in Jerusalem time. And then it says, he will judge between the nations and rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. And nation will not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Now, you know, on this statue given by a Soviet artist, he made a bronze sculpture of a man beating his sword into a plowshare. And what they don't tell you in that is the day that that happens is when the Lord rules and reigns out of Jerusalem. They leave that one conveniently out.
Millennium.
And the millennial reign.
That's right.
So the message here is that somehow the UN is going to take care of this all for you. Through our own efforts, we are going to have peace and safety. Well, yeah, if you believe that one, I got some coastal land in the Bahamas I'd like to sell you. In Micah chapter 4, now it shall come to pass in the latter days, this is almost a repeat verbatim from Isaiah, that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains. It's literally singular, on top of the mountain, and shall be exalted above all the hills, and all the people shall flow to it. Many nations shall come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord. Now they got the tense right. It's only one mountain. To the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion the law goes forth, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he will judge between many people and rebuke strong nations afar off. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks, and nation will not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Well, that sounds like a pretty wonderful thing, right? And the Jewish rabbis and sages all say that during that 1,000-year reign, that the Garden of Eden, at least the atmosphere of the Garden of Eden, will be restored. And that means that, well, as it says later on in Isaiah, the lion will lay down with the lamb and children will play on snakes' dens. And the whole nature of things will change. Whereas wild beasts tore each other apart. You ever watch some of those nature movies? Particularly where they have the wildebeest are crossing this river. And the crocodiles are in the river, and they just tear them all to pieces. I mean, it's not a pleasant thing to see. And you look at all through nature. You watch nature, insects, and here's a praying mantis, and he reaches out and grabs a bug, and while it's still alive, he just chews them all to pieces. I mean, it's not very pleasant. It's not a very wonderful place to be. It's kind of hard to believe that the Garden of Eden was ever like that. I just wonder at what time everything changed. But apparently it changed when Adam sinned.
And you watch the honey badger going after that cobra.
Yeah? Boy, oh boy. Wonder what the honey badgers are going to eat.
I don't know, but we've got our first honey badger president.
Boy, do we not. Oh. So Micah reports here almost in the story. In Ezekiel we find, remember Ezekiel in chapter 40, he got transported to the end of the age. And was on the 10th day of the month, and it doesn't say what month it was. Oh, the beginning of the year on the 10th day of the month. That tells you when it was, doesn't it? That would be Tishri 10. And what is Tishri 10? That's Yom Kippur. So it was on Yom Kippur, after the city was captured on the very same day, the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he took me there. And the vision of God, he took me into the land of Israel and set me on a very high mountain, singular. On it towards the south was something like the structure of a city. Now the remaining part of Ezekiel talks about what he saw and gives specific dimensions to it. And he saw the temple and specific dimensions, exactly how high and how tall and everything. And so there's little doubt about where the temple was and the dimensions of the city. In Zechariah chapter 14 it says, and the Lord shall be king over all the earth in that day, another phrase which refers to the millennial reign. It shall be, the Lord is one, and his name is one, and all the land shall be turned into a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem shall be raised up and inhabited in her place from Benjamin gate to the place of the first gate to the corner gate, and from the tower of Hanel to the king's winepress. I couldn't find where all these points were, but it sounds like there is a square area that is just lifted straight up out of the ground. And there have been some oil men that have done seismic surveys in the region of the temple and on the Mount of Olives. And they found a fault line that runs right smack dab through the Mount of Olives. It implies, and there is a type of a fault called a Hurst fault, which is when the land in a defined area is thrust upward. Apparently, that's what we got here. There is a Hurst fault in the process to bust loose here someday soon.
Volcano? Could that be like a volcano?
No, it doesn't have anything to do with volcanic activity. It just has to do with the nature of the earth and the weak points and the fault lines that are in that area. And so at any rate, the people shall dwell in it, and no longer shall there be utter destruction, but Jerusalem shall be safely inhabited. So we have this prophecy repeated many times in the scripture, that Jerusalem is going to be a place that's high and lifted up, an appropriate place for the Lord to rule and reign out of, because the rest of the world is going to be flat. Now, what does that imply? Well, if we have the facts straight, and I think there's a good argument to be made for it, and that is 12,065 years ago, when the sun went through its nova, it boiled up a tremendous amount of water vapor into the atmosphere, and there was no visible sun for thousands of years. And when Adam was created, he was created in that area of the time when there was no sun visible. And that because the land was probably flat, and because there was water vapor in the air, there was no differential heating of the planet. The water vapor caused the planet to come to an equilibrium in temperature. And unless you have a differential of temperature, you don't have winds. You don't have hurricanes. You don't got nothing. It's just there would be no breeze. And the temperature would stabilize around 72 degrees. And it would drop maybe 1 degree at night. And when it dropped 1 degree, that was enough for the water to plate out on anything on the surface. And that apparently is how the world was watered. So why do I bring this up? Well, I bring it up because every 12,065 years for the last 72,000 years, the sun has novaed. And when I say nova, it doesn't mean that it blew itself all to pieces. It just blew off the outer shell. And that outer shell, when it blew off, the first thing that happened was a huge amount of energy was released in the form of light and gamma rays, X-rays, all sorts of high energy particles moving at the speed of light. And when it hit the planet, it vaporized about 1,000 feet of water out of the oceans on that side of the earth where it was exposed. That's going to happen again. And the prophecies in the scripture say that the sun will produce heat 7 times greater, and men will be burnt up. And they will. It's pretty darn hot. And just like the prophecies have said that the evildoer is going to be burnt up like tinder, that wasn't a figure of speech. That's reality, and it's coming to a planet near you. Moving right along, the house of Jacob. Come, let us walk in the light of the Lord, for you have forsaken your people, the house of Jacob, because they were filled with eastern ways. They are soothsayers like the Philistines. They are pleased with the children of foreigners. Their land is also full of silver and gold, and there is no end to their treasures. Their land is full of horses, and there is no end to their chariots. Does that sound like us? They are filled with eastern ways. We have got every kind of religion under the sun on this planet, in our country right now. And if you will notice, the mainstream media has not a kind word to say about Christians. Christians are wild-eyed, crazy bigots. and you're racist, and you're homophobic, and, well, I can't think of any other nasty words, but that's what you are anyway.
The problem with these churches, they're tax exempt. People are using it for the jet airplanes and all these fancy homes, they don't pay no taxes. That's a real problem.
Well, it's a problem. Well, wealth is a terrible thing to happen, believe it or don't. Every time I think they did a survey of all the millionaires that were in existence in the 1920s, and almost every last one of them met an untimely death, either by their own hand, many of them by their own hand, but most of them, well, all of them, from what I understand, they didn't have an easy passage out of this life. And the problem with having lots of money is, what's the tendency?
Satan.
You want to rely on your money. So if bad times come, how are you going to get saved? Well, I'm going to buy me an airplane and fly out of here. Or I'm going to buy me a hole in the ground and I'm going to pull the dirt in over me and I'm going to be safe. And you're just going to get burned up. Well, the problem is coming when your money is not going to save you. And we're going to learn that people will, at that time, they will take their silver and gold and throw it out in the street, because when they see Nibiru coming, there ain't no hope for them. Where do you put your hope? How can you buy your way out of that one?
Jesus Christ.
That's the only hope. If you want out, that's the only way out. Well, filled with these Eastern ways, you can see how the Eastern ways of mysticism and these crazy religions like Islam and others, plenty of those going around, and they are treated kindly with the mainstream media, even though their very holy books support the fact of killing Jews and Christians, getting rid of those ugly people, those crazy people that believe that there's a God, and that he's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And our land is full of silver and gold. We're a rich country. There's no end of our treasures. We are the richest country in the world. The poorest in our country is better than the richest in Nigeria. And our land is full of cars. And no end of our SUVs. We've got cars and SUVs like you wouldn't believe. We got so many cars, we don't have enough concrete to support them all. And so, hey, if it applied to them back that day, it sure does today. And their land is full of idols. Oh, we don't have no idols, do we? They worship the work of their hands. Well, I guess that makes it an idol, doesn't it? That which their own fingers have made. People bow down and each man humbles himself, therefore they do not forgive them. Enter into the rock and hide in the dust, for the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty. It's on the way. The lofty looks of man shall be humbled, and the haughtiness of men shall be bowed down, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. And I'll guarantee you it's going to happen. We know exactly why. Definition of an idol. An object of extreme devotion. Do we have any? Looks like a place of worship to me. There's another place of worship. We just have different idols. There are some worshipers. That looks like some worshipers to me. Extreme devotion. And more of them worshipers. On Sunday, do they not worship on Sunday afternoon? Sure do. For the day of the Lord of hosts shall come upon everything proud and lofty, and upon everything lifted up, and it shall be brought low, and upon the cedars of Lebanon that are high and lifted up, and upon the oaks of Bashan, upon all the high mountains, and upon all the hills that are lifted up, and every high tower, and upon every fortified wall, upon the ships of Tarshish, and upon all the beautiful sloops. Well, that's crafts, beautiful crafts. The loftiness of man shall be bowed down, and the haughtiness of men shall be brought low, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. But the idols he shall utterly abolish. Don't be putting your money in any insurance policies for any of these stadiums around here. They shall go into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth for the terror of the Lord, from the terror of the Lord, and the glory of his majesty when he arises to shake the earth mightily. Oh, where have we heard that phrase before? looky here. We got some mighty powerful ships in the world. There's one, the biggest one I could find on the internet. 564,763 deadweight tons. Can you imagine that? Why should that float? That's too heavy to float. You can't float a boat. And then we got this one, 100,000 tons. That's the Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier. 100,000 tons. And is not the pride of our country carried on that ship? How about the Ruskies? They got a Typhoon class submarine. It's about half the size of an aircraft carrier. And that thing goes underwater. And no telling how many missiles that thing carries, about 32, I think. So the pride of the Soviets, I think the Kursk was one of those Typhoon class. And those crazy people, they tried to, they've got a torpedo system that goes about 200 miles an hour in the water. And it was propelled by hydrogen peroxide fuel. Well, the problem with hydrogen peroxide is, and it hits metal, it gives off hydrogen gas real fast, chews up the metal, and if there's any spark or ignition source anywhere around, it'll detonate. They blew the front end off of their ship because they had a leak of hydrogen peroxide. And they tried to claim that the U.S. torpedoed their ship. Of course, it was hard to prove because when they got on there and saw it, it showed the explosion was from the inside out and the thing peeled open. What's that?
Wasn't that the one that was right off our coast?
No, this one was, they keep these things pretty close to the Soviet Union, yeah.
You ever been to San Jose or Santa Cruz, California? They have a concrete boat. I don't know if it ever floated, but there's one there.
Yeah, they thought about making concrete boats. They thought about making ice ships out of ice, and make them for aircraft carriers.
That's good, tell you, the Atlantic Ocean.
Now, we had-
Ain't too good no more.
So anyway, we've got lots of ships tied up in Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 20. In that day, man will cast aside his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which he has made for himself to worship, to the moles and the bats, because, well, bad things are coming. To go to the clefts of the rocks and the crags of the rugged rocks, from the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty, when he raises to shake the earth mightily. Sever yourselves from such a man, whose breath is in his nostrils, for what account is he? Well, you can imagine what's going to go through the hearts and the minds of people when someday, in the near future, I'm not sure we'll ever get to see it, but we might, when they see this flaming ball of fire coming out of the sky, and NASA never told us about it. Well, too late. You should have known. Yeah. Revelation chapter 6, and the earth departed as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. And the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the chief captains, the mighty men, and every bondman and every free man. To leave anybody out? Everybody. They hid themselves in dens and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the rocks and the mountains, fall on us and hide us from the face of him that sat on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of his wrath is come, and who is able to stand? That is what they're going to say. And they're going to think that if they hide themselves in rocks, they are somehow going to be saved. They're not. These holes that they've dug in the ground will become their graves. Behold, I myself have created the smith who blows the fire of coals and brings out the weapon for its work. I have created the destroyer to ruin. Who do you suppose he was talking about? Well, I think it was Nibiru, also known as Leviathan. In that day, the Lord, with his severe sword, great and strong, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent. Leviathan, the twisted serpent, and he will slay the reptile that's in the sea. And in Job it says, by his spirit he has garnished the heavens, and his hand has formed the crooked serpent. You notice in almost every culture of the world, they have a notion about some serpent in the sky. The Chinese call it a dragon. Where do you think the witch flying on a broomstick came from? Yeah, it was him. Right. The Mayas had a symbol of a feathered serpent, a crooked feathered serpent. Where do you think that came from?
I think that's the devil we're talking about, Satan.
I think we're talking about this. In Pliny's Natural History, 91st edition, second book, it reads, a terrible comet was seen by the people of Ethiopia and Egypt, to which Typhon, the king of that period, gave his name. It had a fiery appearance, and it was twisted like a coil, a twisted serpent. And it was very grim to behold, and it was not really a star as much as what might be called a ball of fire.
Great balls of fire.
Balls of fire, and that's what it looks like. It's a great ball of fire, and you see all the junk all around it?
Yeah.
That's because it's an unstable brown dwarf star, and it blows off its outer shell about once every year or so. And when it blows off chunks of iron, because this thing is mostly made out of iron. And those chunks of iron are all around it, and they're about 1 million miles around this star. So when the Earth passes through the tail of it, it's going to get hit like a shotgun.
It creates more asteroids.
Yeah, it creates more of them, and there are trillions of them. Now, this is what it looks like. Well, the first picture that we got, of course, you've seen it before. In 2008, the South Pole Telescope shot that picture. That's the first one that got on the internet. It's an infrared telescope, and that's the only way you can see it right now. But it's making the sign of the cross. How can you miss this that's coming? Remember, in Matthew 24, it says that the world will mourn when they see the sign of the coming of the Son of Man. I submit to you, plaintiffs, exhibit number 1, Nibiru, looking like a cross with a blood-red body. The end. So,
Well, there are many signs, that's just one of them.
that's one of the signs, but it's the one that was never talked about much in the Scripture, that there is a sign of the coming of the Son of Man. And as Matthew 24 says, it's going to cause the world to mourn when they see it. We didn't understand why the world was supposed to mourn when they see it. We understand now, because that is the destroyer that God has created. And that is what the mechanism for all of the events of Revelation.
And the odds are getting greater every year because it produces more asteroids.
Yeah, when you got
The Son of
trillions
Man
of
is
them,
not
though.
a person?
What's that?
So the Son of Man is not a person?
Well, of course he is.
Well, do you have any, I don't know, it's not Jesus, they're
Yeah.
not referring, well, 'cause he's
That's
the
one
Son
of the
God.
titles of the Messiah, is the Son of Man.
Well, he's the Son of God, I thought maybe the Son of Man was somebody else.
Well, he is both Son of God and Son of Man. He is a dual-natured being. That is represented by the centaur of the constellation Virgo, one of the decans of Virgo. It's a double-natured being, both man and wild donkey. Well, the wild donkey is the man, is the man equivalent, and then of course the head is a head of a god or man. But it's a double-natured being. So, yeah, that's one of the messianic terms that the Jews use. I'm going to turn the air up.
What about the red planet is actually orange or is it brown?
You're making it cool.
Well, it's called a brown dwarf, but it's actually red. It's red because of,
Infrared shows it red.
it's,
Infrared shows it red.
well, actually infrared, it's red. But visible light, it's also red. But the problem with it is that the red light that it does produce, is so faint that you can't see it.
I see.
And if you look on the internet under TRAPPIST-1, you will find that NASA has claimed to have discovered a brown dwarf star with 7 stars rotating around it, 7 planets rotating around it. And they claim that it's 39 light years away. And they can tell that it's got 7 planets around it, and it gives you the size of the planets. It gives you the nature of the star. They say its atmosphere blows off once every year or so, and that it's surrounded by all kinds of junk. And they give you a complete story of Nibiru. I can guarantee you that TRAPPIST-1 is not where they claim it to be, because if it's 39 light years away, you can't even see the light of it, even in infrared. That is 374 trillion miles away, and the thing is putting out such little light that you can't see it. You can't even see it in our solar system. It's so dim.
They don't want to scare you.
Well, the powers that be are happy and just content as they can be, because you know why? They think there's too many people on this planet anyway. This is a good way to wipe them all out. And then we'll start all over again. And they believe they are going to be saved by building these big tunnels underground. The Russians, like I said, they've got 400 square miles cut out of the Urals where they're going to put their whole population. What are we? We've got tunnels under our nation, but it's not for you. It's just for the rich and the elite. They are happy for you to get French fried and beat to pieces. As long as they survive, then they'll come out. And they've even dug in, as I understand it, I don't know if this is true, but they claim that they've dug in subterranean tunnels into the ocean around Washington State, Seattle, around Seattle, big enough to hide their submarines. So we can pull the submarines in, and the Chinese have done the same thing. We often wondered why the Chinese had done that. Well, it's not to protect them from a nuclear strike. It's to protect them from an asteroid strike. And the Chinese are figuring that most of their population is going to be decimated, and their land, most of it will be underwater. And you know what they've done? They built this highway to nowhere, deep into the western part of their nation, and built whole cities back there. They're uninhabited. Why did they do that? Well, they're counting on them being some survivors, and they're going to be going there because all their coastal lying cities are going to be underwater, and all their people, millions of them, will be killed.
I heard the Clinton Foundation funding this, what you're talking about. The Clinton Foundation.
Oh, well, wouldn't surprise me, but...
And why do you think the Clintons have been so friendly to the Chinese and Dianne Feinstein,
Money.
all of them?
Well,
That movie going there.
The powers that be want a one world government, and this is one way they can see to do it. You can't have a one world government and have national borders. How do you break down the borders? Overrun them with immigrants. They're trying to overrun our country with immigration right now.
Right.
Thank God we've got a delay in things because we got a president that didn't, he didn't subscribe to the game plan. And that's why everybody is so mad. You notice they're all saying what a horrible president is. The country can't stand this president any longer. Well, it's not the country can't stand it. It's they can't stand it. So,
Well, obviously, it's not going to be a Rosh Hashanah in the next few years because that Hebrew is not even close enough for people to mourn.
we don't know, and it doesn't really happen. If you read the Revelation account, we don't actually pass through the tail of it till the 7th year of the tribulation. Wow. And so it's going to be a while before that happens. Now, the next key trigger that I see, at least, is this JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It has to be signed with the Antichrist. When that is signed on a Yom Kippur, the Rosh Hashanah before that, we're out of here. And I was hoping it would be this year. Not a chance of that happening this year. So we got at least another year in my estimation. I really don't want to be here another year. I'm getting old. I'm tired of this place. I want to get out.
Get out there and fly.
What's that?
Get out there and fly.
Yeah.
Well, the oak tree's still down there, you know.
Yeah, I know. Well, that may be the way I get out. I don't know.
We'll start with him first.
Yeah.
I volunteer.
I tell you, no other Sunday school teacher operates under the level of stress that I do. I tell you what, constantly threatening me. Okay, well,
Sitting next to your Grandpa needed water. Grandpa, when's Grandma getting up for breakfast? Grandma.
Well, I'm